In the 70 years before the Civil War, the United States grew swiftly from a tiny group of raw new states huddled along the Atlantic coastline to a nation stretching 3,000 miles across to the shores of the Pacific. Acquisition of territory after territory began with the Northwest Territory ceded to us by England after the Revolutionary War, continued with the purchase of Louisiana and the annexation of Florida. America had sent Lewis and Clark to explore the Oregon Territory, which lay between Canada and the United States, claimed by both, as well as by Spain and Russia for a time. The fair division of Oregon was delayed temporarily, but internal developments, both in the territory itself and in the rest of the country, now began to bring the Oregon issue to the fore again. After the War of 1812, Britain and the United States had agreed to occupy the Oregon country together. According to the terms of the Rush-Bagot Treaty of 1817, which was renewed in 1827, a permanent settlement was put off and put off again, while both Canadians and Americans were free to settle where they would in Oregon. Further terms of this agreement were designed to reduce tension between the two countries. The United States and Britain agreed to limit the size and number of their warships on the Great Lakes and Lake Champlain to the extent of virtual naval disarmament on these commonly shared waters. In 1818, another treaty fixed the northern boundary between the Louisiana Territory and Canada at the 49th parallel, as far west as the Rocky Mountains. But Oregon's future remained unclear. At this time, Oregon country included part of what is now known as Canada. During the War of 1812, Western expansionists in the United States had cast greedy eyes on Canada itself and its lucrative fur trade. In fact, our opening move of the War of 1812 had been against Canada. The United States was not successful in this campaign, and by 1814, the idea of gaining Canada for ourselves was abandoned. The decision to delay a final settlement of the sensitive question of Oregon was made by a bankrupt Congress, sick to the death of what they had termed Madison's War, and desiring no more trouble with England. After this, many disputes between the two nations were settled by peaceful negotiation. For example, the boundary between Maine and Canada was settled by the Webster-Ashburton Treaty of 1842. By 1844, several thousand Americans had settled in Oregon. There was a sudden great surge westward. Indeed, territorial expansion was the keynote of the 1840-1850 decade. A vigorous, restless, sprawling America, which had only begun to settle the eastern edges of the Louisiana Territory, looked beyond the Great Plains to the vast regions of the far west. The phrase manifest destiny began to be heard in many quarters. It was a term used by ardent American nationalists who argued that it was the obvious, unquestionable destiny of the United States of America to push out on all sides of the North American continent. So settlers from the east and those newly arriving from Europe braved the long, agonizing, dangerous journey across country. Fur traders had set up posts in the Oregon country. One of the earliest and most successful of these was John Jacob Astor, a businessman from New York City. Astor established a trading post on the Columbia River, named for himself, Astoria. At first, his Oregon business failed, and he sold his property rights to Canadians. The War of 1812 intervened, and after it, Astor found himself right back in Oregon and back in business. Meanwhile, his personal fortune had grown considerably due to two similar business ventures which did not fail, one on the Great Lakes and one on the Western Plains. Eventually, Astor's American Fur Company became the foundation of one of the largest family estates in America. But Astor's highly efficient, highly organized company was not typical of the fur trade in Oregon. Most of the other trappers were on their own, working for themselves. They usually arrived in Oregon with just enough money for a stake. That is, enough to purchase pack mules, traps, a few utensils, ammunition, and other bare essentials. These fur traders spent months in the lonely mountains and forests. They were often in danger from hostile Indians. They were gamblers of the most daring kind, but the stakes were high. Fortunes were to be made from the much sought-after foxtails, bearskins, otter, muskrat, and beaver skins that were to be had for the taking. On the hope of this kind of success, intrepid men, or desperate men, those who could withstand the hardships of loneliness, scanty food, long freezing winters, and constant Indian threats, gambled their lives. Settlers followed quickly upon the heels of the traders, using the isolated posts as centers of civilization in the wilderness, building their villages and towns around the small posts. In the meantime, Canadian fur traders had not been idle, and the same sort of Canadian pioneer settlements sprang up. It was obvious that the time for delay and temporizing on the Oregon issue was over. The Americans in Oregon felt that the boundary question should be settled. The presidential campaign of 1844 centered chiefly about this one issue. Extremists in the West and even other sections of the country demanded all of Oregon as far north as the parallel line of 54 degrees, 40 minutes, or to the southernmost tip of Russian Alaska. The cry, 54-40 or fight, was heard from one end of America to the other. Of course, England would not sit still for any such thing. Negotiations were in order. In 1846, the United States and Britain agreed to divide Oregon along the 49th parallel. Aside from the fact that practical, realistic leaders in our government did not want still a third war with Britain, there was another factor which prompted the United States to an amicable settlement. Texas had just been admitted to the Union. We knew that this step put us irrevocably on the verge of a war with Mexico. The idea of a two-front hostility with the sparsely settled, difficult-to-supply western United States, caught in between the two antagonists, was to be avoided at all costs. Therefore, it was decided to extend the previous boundary, which had stopped at the Rocky Mountains, straight out along the 49th parallel to the Pacific. Canada was also granted the entire area of Vancouver Island. Out of the region we received were formed the states of Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. Now that the boundary was fixed, another spurt of westward expansion began. Trade with the far west increased. The old route from St. Louis to Independence, Missouri, and on across Kansas to Santa Fe, called the Santa Fe Trail, revived with increased vigor for a while. Cotton cloth, guns, tools, and other manufactured articles were brought out to the west. Furs came back. Although there was ruthless competition between the traders, they banded together in wagon trains while crossing the Indian-populated Kansas country. Further west, in the years before the Mexican War, Americans began moving into California in large numbers to trade and to build homes. Spain had long occupied Lower California, but not until 1769 had any real attempt been made to colonize the north. This was done largely through the Roman Catholic missions. California broke with Spain in 1822, and from then on the Americans had been filtering in. President Polk wanted to push our boundaries out to the Pacific on the south as well as on the north. A good deal of concentrated effort and much talk went into the various plans which might accomplish this further expansion. Polk had his eye mainly on California, which was already swarming with Americans. However, Mexican territory stood in the way of Polk's plan. Arizona, New Mexico, and California belonged to Mexico. Relations between the United States and Mexico were badly strained over the entire issue of the Texan Revolt, the establishment of the Republic of Texas, which Mexico had never acknowledged, and the frankly warlike act of admitting Texas into the Union. Polk hoped he might settle the territory issue peacefully. He hoped to be able to deal with it as an issue separate from the Texas question, but Mexico would not go along with him. Polk offered to buy this area, but the Mexican government refused to sell. Their representatives told Polk in no uncertain terms that as far as Mexico was concerned, the expansionist, supranationalistic leanings of the United States were antagonistic to the interests of Mexico. They had lost face badly in the Texas situation. They had lost a huge land area, many troops, much money, world prestige, and self-respect. They were not about to let America set her toe in Mexico's door again. Mexico also disputed the southern boundary of Texas. There was a narrow strip of land between Nueces and the Rio Grande rivers, which was claimed by both Texas and Mexico, and it was here, a short while later, that the long-expected Mexican War began. In 1846, a small band of Mexicans crossed the Rio Grande. This was the opening incident of the war. At any other time and under any other circumstances, this might have been dismissed as a mere border incident, but things had gone too far. A battle occurred in which several American soldiers were killed. The Mexicans felt that they were occupying their own territory. Unfortunately, the Americans felt equally justified that it was their own land which was being invaded. News of the battle flew back to Washington instantly. But America, long anticipating trouble from south of the border, had not been caught napping. Our armies had been camped ready for battle throughout the Southwest, waiting for word from Washington. Polk claimed Mexico had invaded our territory and asked Congress to declare war. This was speedily accomplished. The war was planned in two offensives against Mexico itself and against California, New Mexico, and Arizona. Polk saw the chance of a lifetime for the United States to acquire those lands which Mexico had refused to part with peacefully. Colonel Stephen Kearny was ordered to march overland and take the western territories. However, at Santa Fe, he was met by Kit Carson, who told him that John C. Fremont, an American Army officer, supposedly on a peaceful exploratory trip through California, had become involved in something called the Bear Flag Republic movement in that area. Fremont's activities in helping gain California for America in the Mexican War have been open to question, and later he was sent back to Washington to be court-martialed. But Kearny pushed on nevertheless, following his original orders. Polk sent an army under Zachary Taylor into the disputed area. Taylor moved first into northern Mexico. He gained the heavily fortified city of Monterrey, and then, although handicapped by the fact that half of his army had been sent to Veracruz, he won the Battle of Buena Vista, completely defeating Santa Anna. However, the war was not won by the victories in California nor in northern Mexico, but by the American Army's brilliant march into the Mexican capital. The war ended in September 1847, when General Winfield Scott captured Mexico City. He had secured the surrender of Veracruz. Then, by sharp, sudden attacks, he took the strong positions of Cerro Gordo, Molina del Rey, and Chapultepec. In September, he stood before Mexico City. The next day, the capital surrendered. The war was won. There were many Americans who felt that we should demand all of Mexico, but a fairer settlement was worked out. By the Treaty of Peace of 1848, we secured a vast area as far as the Pacific Ocean. This was called the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. According to its terms, the boundary between Texas and Mexico was fixed as the Rio Grande River. The United States obtained the New Mexico and California territories, paying $15 million outright and assuming $3 million in claims of American citizens against Mexico. Meanwhile, gold was discovered in California. Thousands of Americans rushed there. John A. Sutter, a German miller, found a vein of gold ore in his estate of New Helvetia, where the city of Sacramento now stands. The story of the gold rush to California in 1849 and 1850 is the story of a nation suddenly gone wild. News of the first discovery turned San Francisco into a deserted city overnight. More than 20,000 people set out overland from the east, suffering incredible hardships in the search for riches. Many more thousands arrived by boat. These prospectors and would-be prospectors called themselves the 49ers. The rapid growth of population in California led to its admission into the Union in 1815. The territory did not even have to undergo the usual processes of territorial organization and provisional government, so dramatic was its growth rate. California has continued through the years to attract millions of new citizens so that today it has the largest population of any state in the country. By 1853, the United States stretched from coast to coast, covering an area of more than 3 million square miles. The nation fought the War of 1812 partly in the hope of winning Canada. It was ready to fight for its claim to part of Oregon, and it finally did go to war with Mexico to round out the southwestern boundary. Our objective was to gain security and elbow room. In a series of giant steps, the nation fulfilled its manifest destiny. Now let's see how well you remember. Here is a list of 6 statements, one of which is false. See if you can spot the false statement. 1. In 1843, a great movement of pioneers into Oregon began. 2. By a treaty with Britain, the Oregon Territory was divided between Britain and the United States. 3. Mexico offered to sell the combined California, New Mexico, Arizona Territory to the United States. 4. A war against Mexico resulted from a border incident in 1846. 5. As a result of this war, we secured a vast stretch of land as far as the Pacific. 6. By 1853, our country stretched from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean. Did you spot the false statement? Here are the true ones. Things to remember. 1. In 1843, a great movement of pioneers into Oregon began. 2. By a treaty with Great Britain, the Oregon Territory was divided between Britain and the United States. 3. A war against Mexico resulted from a border incident in 1846. 4. As a result of this war, we secured a vast stretch of land as far as the Pacific. 5. By 1853, our country stretched from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean. Number 3 in the first list was false. Mexico offered to sell the combined California, New Mexico, Arizona Territory to the United States is wrong. President Polk offered to buy the California, New Mexico, Arizona Territory, but the Mexican government refused to sell is correct. From the Revolution down to the Civil War, territorial expansion dominated American foreign policy. Repeatedly, the United States bought land or went to war to extend its boundaries. Then, except for unsuccessful efforts of Southern slaveholders to acquire more land for slavery in the Caribbean, the United States ceased expanding until the end of the 19th century. The purchase of Alaska from Russia in 1867 was an isolated incident, uninteresting to the majority of the people and unpopular until long years after.